So we're going to go ahead and begin. My name is John Hood. I'll be moderating today. As is standard procedure here with FreeOp, we aren't going to go into elaborate introductions. Those are available for you in the schedule and online, so you can check those out if you haven't already. Instead, we're just going to dive right in, if you don't mind, and ask a few questions of our panelists, and we will reserve some time, about 10 minutes at the end, for questions from you all. So, very simple question to get us started. Each of you works or knows a lot about policy reforms at the state level. So I'd love for you to give us an example of one or two ideas that you have seen that have been enacted or about to be enacted that really give you a lot of hope and a lot of optimism about the success of the freedom movements in the states, particularly issues that will help to improve social mobility all across our country. Grover, we'll start with you.
The biggest advantage that free market people, pro-freedom people have is that we can use federalism, because with the 50 states, if we have a good idea and it works in Arizona, going to zero on the income tax, education savings accounts, occupational licensing, moving across state lines, and it works because they're good ideas, they can go state to state. And what really has been helpful to see is, since people invented Zoom, we have seen on each of the ones that I just mentioned, you've gone from North Carolina thinking it'd be a good idea to phase out the income tax 12 years ago to 12 states where you can say the governor and the legislature is committed to going to zero. The state is going to zero. And the explosion on educational savings accounts and on occupational licensing and a whole series of other issues, the left's handicap is that their ideas don't work. And so if you try them in Vermont, as they did with government-run health care, they had to repeal it. And when Dukakis was running for president in '88, he said, well, I've passed mandate government-run health care, government-mandated health care in Massachusetts. Well, it hadn't taken effect, and as soon as he lost the election, Massachusetts repealed it because they couldn't live with it in one state. It was too obviously stupid. So the left can only put bad ideas in at the national level, and we can put them in state by state and see them go forward. And I don't know which one you're going to pick, because Arizona's got so many, but those are the three that there are a series of them that have really gone state by state. And one quick story, and they go, never mind the state, in a state where the Senate leader had been raising taxes, and so we had been unpleasant to him. My staff said, you really should call this guy because maybe we need to work together in the future. So I called and said hi, and we really didn't talk about 2 years ago. But I said, well, here's what's happening, and I talked about all the states that were phasing out the income tax. I mentioned 2 state Senate leaders and a speaker who had been leading on it. They were 3 of his best friends, and he went from having raised taxes the previous 2 years to 4 months after I talked to him, getting legislation passed to phase the income tax down to zero, because he learned that these other guys who he trusted had done it, and nobody died, and nobody lost an election. And I would add, criminal justice reform is in the same zone.
Well, there was a lot there, but a lot to really say in terms of policy items for the states. But I will say that the approach matters quite a bit in terms of trying to convince policymakers that an idea is a good one, and that its time has arrived. And in Arizona, I would say the two that are most personal to me, partially because I was the one that did them, but also because they've ended up being very big, are the flat tax that we enacted, and then in terms of reducing our income tax significantly, which was pretty big. I mean, and just to give you some idea, I think it was over 16% of our budget in 1 year, of the total state budget. I mean, that is a massive. I'm still challenging people to try to find one that's bigger in terms of impact as a percentage of our overall budget. And then, of course, since we're talking about freedom in particular, school choice. I mean, that was for us to go to universal, and it was, of course, built on the work that had been done by others up to this point. We didn't invent ESAs, but we had a very limited version of that, and I've been telling people on this trip that actually I happened to be here in D.C. when Governor Youngkin got elected on that Tuesday, completely unrelated to any of that, and it's sort of, well, wait a minute, if if school choice is popular in Virginia, which is a blue state, then why don't we just go for broke in Arizona and go for the whole thing? And people thought I was nuts, including my friends. I admit it, but now look what's happened. All these other states have now doing it. And how else are you going to break the stranglehold of the left on education and higher education than to empower parents to make a different choice in a very real way? If we're committed to freedom, that's why it's sort of ironic to me that you have certain red states that just don't want to let this go because they're afraid that somehow this is going to hurt their local school or their rural district or whatever. That's not where the problem is. Let's be honest. The problem is in urban centers where there is no accountability, where nobody really knows who the teachers are, who the principals are, who the superintendent is. It's not in your local community where you can hold them responsible for transvestite story hour or whatever it is that they're pushing that parents think is ridiculous. So that's why we need school choice fundamentally. Anyway, there's a lot to say about this, but at the end of the day, I think the friendly competition among states, and you see again, we kicked off school choice as one example. We did the flat tax before, which sort of kicks off this competition among states to do better. And that's a really good thing.
Well, I don't know if I can pick one specific reform that I'm most excited about, but why I love working in the States is like when I first met Speaker Toma before he was Speaker, I asked him, what are you most passionate about? And he just goes, backpack funding. And Michael, who works in the Arizona House as well, ended up helping him devise a unique system to try to get that done. So I always ask every legislator, what are you trying to accomplish? How can I connect you with resources in DC or other places where there may be some expertise there? And one crazy one that I heard recently is the Speaker of the House in Tennessee, Cameron Sexton. He goes, I'm just so sick of DC and what they're doing to education. I'm just going to turn down the $4 billion. I don't want it. Maybe Grover will disagree, but they say they've run out of taxes to cut, yet they keep having budget surpluses. So, this could end up being another case like a few years ago when I talked to Speaker Toma, where he wanted backpack funding, found a way to make it happen. Who knows if Speaker Sexton will be able to find a way to just say, we don't want the federal money. We're going to fund it ourselves for a lot cheaper and not have these handcuffs anymore. So there's no shortage of ideas. And another reason why the states are great is, unlike in DC, things can just pass the common sense test. If you go in and pitch something like paying for outcomes on parole and probation or prisons rather than just paying for caseloads, people can say, no, that makes sense. Yeah, you only get paid if the crime goes down. Okay, let's try it. Whereas in D.C., you have to have all these stupid coalition meetings. You have to go and do endless meetings that turn into nothing with members of Congress. It's just a waste of time and effort. Whereas in the States, you can bring good ideas, and because you have decent people there who are serving and trying to get back to their communities, if they agree with you and want to give it a shot, you've got a pretty good chance of getting it done.
Does everybody understand backpack funding? Or do you need that answer? What?
Oh, just as a shorthand for the money follows the students rather than goes to the systems. Yeah.
I just didn't know if everybody knew that language. So my name is Randy Hicks. I'm with the Georgia Center for Opportunity based in Atlanta. I'm going to talk about something that's a little more difficult. These guys have all covered very important issues that we're interested in and we're involved in, but I'm going to talk about one that actually at some level requires federal involvement, but the states really have to initiate change, and that's safety net reform. It is not, our concern about it isn't just that it's unsustainable, expensive, and inefficient. It's that it's robbing people of their humanity. There are millions of Americans who aren't able to pursue those things that you and I pursue because the safety net is more sticky. It's more like a snare net than a safety net. It's very sticky, keeps people from often accepting jobs, accepting promotions, et cetera. And so what we know about safety net reform is that if it's ever going to happen in any significant way, it's going to start at the state level. The state that so far has done the most from an innovation standpoint is the state of Utah, which integrated their workforce services with their welfare services. In fact, they don't have a welfare office per se. It's called the Department of Workforce Services. And when you enter into that office, your first conversation is about work. Are you able to work? What was your last job? What have you done in the past? That's the start of the conversation for able-bodied recipients of welfare programs. And then the traditional welfare programs are called work supports. So it's a totally different mindset where rather than assuming that someone's trapped, you're looking to help them climb out and become self-sufficient. The idea of escaping poverty is an important one here, because escaping requires someone to actually be able to escape. There's something about agency that's involved there. And currently our system, again, there are all sorts of reasons for it, but our system is really sticky. In fact, so what we're doing right now is we've entered into a partnership with a number of other state-level think tanks to promote on Capitol Hill a bill that would give states the flexibility to integrate workforce and welfare services. I just told you about what Utah did. They're the only state in the country that's done it, and no other state can do it now. Because soon after they did that in the late 90s, the federal government changed the law around WIOA, and that won't go into all the details there. So now states need permission to do that kind of integration. So we're working on that so that states can innovate, states can come up with more creative ways to move people from dependency to self-sufficiency. So that's one of the things we're excited about. 5 years ago, I don't know if there was a state interested. Now we're working with leaders in 10 different states who are very interested in pushing meaningful reform.
Randy, just hold on to that mic for a
Yeah.
second. We'll come back the other way. So we've heard several themes so far about, for example, the idea that states can learn from each other. That's one of the advantages of leaning into the state model for reform, is experimentation, learning what works, learning what doesn't work. We've heard some other opportunities that states present. I want to talk about state capitals in a little bit, but let's actually start in the other direction. And you know about this, Randy, because you've experienced it, and all of you can speak to this. Talk about some barriers that exist at the state level. What kinds of, we know interest groups are a problem at every level of government. We know that inertia is a problem at every level of government, and other kinds of barriers to freedom-oriented reforms in the state. So talk a little bit about, DC is an obstacle, no question about it. In your case in particular, it's impossible to act unless you loosen the strings. But what are some barriers that you see at the state capitals, at the state and local level, that make it difficult to pursue?
Yeah, well, Speaker Toma will be very aware of this, but superintendents can often be a major hindrance to school choice. So at every level of government, there are special and selfish interests. It's the reality, and they will stand in the way of reform. So on school choice, what we've found is our biggest opponents on school choice in Georgia are superintendents, right? Because they're typically, I believe this is true in most states, it's the largest employer in every county or in every district. So that is a major barrier to getting something done, and they wield a lot of power. I would also say another barrier is just imagination. Lawmakers typically, and with all due respect, Speaker Toma has a great imagination, but they lack imagination. They live with what is, and they can't imagine a different way of doing things. And then when you try to bring about significant change, you are disrupting a lot of interests in your state and in your community, and they will come out of the woodwork. I mean, in a heartbeat. You could be having a constructive conversation with the governor, with the legislators about a change that's needed. The minute you go public, you find out you have opponents you didn't know existed. So you're still dealing with special interests at the state level just like you are at the federal level.
I think one of the hardest things for especially those who live and work in DC to understand is the absolute lack of staff in almost every state capital. For example, in Utah, House members have an intern, which is more often than not a high school student, during session only, so only for those 40 days. The rest of the time they're on their own, and leadership has, a small office that can help them, but they really do not have staff. And think about legislators too. You're not getting rich off of doing this. It's not like going to Congress where you can quickly become a centimillionaire with just some smart trades. But in the state level, people have to hold down other jobs. So they don't have time to dig into all these policies. I really apologize to all of you, but they have absolutely no time to read a 10-page even paper. You have to put on a different hat, for every 5-minute meeting when you're a legislator, you have to run around to all the different committees you have to serve on. You're carrying sometimes 15 bills that are your own in addition to all the ones you're helping quarterback behind the scenes. So they just do not have the capacity with their other jobs, the part-time nature of legislatures and limited staff, to really take on and own a lot of these issues. So that's why I do think it creates an opportunity, though, for the negative side for corporate lobbyists who, they often rely on for figuring out just like sniff test on a bill, what's wrong here. But for groups like where most of us work, if you can come in and be a trusted source and help them get the work done to accomplish what both of you want to together, there's a huge opportunity. It's not a willingness question in my experience, it's a capacity question. So if you can help them solve capacity, you can get both of what you want a lot more often.
And I agree with both of the points, actually. Often it's just that we've never done it that way before type of thing, where that isn't it. It's human nature, right? No matter, every time you try to make some sort of change, you're gonna run against that. In addition, I do think you're absolutely right. I mean, just to give you some idea, in Arizona, we're technically a part-time legislature, and so, by the way, if you actually want to get anything done, forget the part-time part. But anyway, 24K a year isn't exactly gonna make you rich, which is what our compensation is. But the thing I wanted to mention is that we had roughly 1,800 bills last session that we'd have to read. Now, some of them are fairly short and easy to grasp. Some of them are just a joke and they're never going to move forward because they're from the other party or whatever. But it's still a lot. And there are days when we vote on 80 bills on the same day. You vote on 80 bills and you got to go, and you're switching subjects, and you have no choice but to identify those people that you trust that will give you the straight answer on whether or not you should be a yes or no on this other bill. And you have to depend on relationships, and that's very important. But if you come to me, even as a speaker, with a 10-page whatever, I guarantee you I won't read it. And it's not because I don't think you're great and that you didn't do good work. It's just because I have 80 other things I have to do that day, and there just isn't the time to go through it. So just understand what you're up against. It's chaos. Unlike in Washington, where you might pass a bill once in a while, we pass 80 a day in some cases, as I said before, and it's a much more condensed, a much more sort of Wild West, I guess, since we're in Arizona, I'll use that term. But often at state legislators, it's just how things are. So when you hear things like we're drinking from a fire hose, I know that's overused, but that's what's happening on a daily basis, and you just need to understand that. That also is the opportunity, though, right? Because that there's something is happening at least. So at least we should be able to influence and make sure that whatever is happening is a good thing as opposed to a bad thing.
It's difficult to pass things in D.C. because you have a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, Democratic president, and so you can have a good idea and all the Republicans can like it and it can't pass. You can have an idea the Democrats like and it won't pass. The good news and the bad news at the state level is everything's almost red or blue. And on the map that I shared with people, there are 23 red states: Republican governor, Republican House, Republican Senate. If the Republicans can work together, even with a 1-vote margin in the House and Senate, this guy moved mountains with magic in passing both the tax reduction and the single rate tax and the school choice with a 1-vote margin in both houses, with one person who had a plate in his brain, and it was tough to talk to him and get him to remember what was said the other day, next day. So, but you needed that vote, okay? You needed every single vote. I'm not making fun of the guy. That's just what it was. But you have 23 states that are red where you can pass legislation if the R's get together. Add to that 4 states here. Louisiana now is going to have a Republican governor, but Louisiana has 2/3 to override. North Carolina has 2/3 to override Democratic governor. Kentucky needs a simple majority to override, and Kansas has 2/3 to override. So in 23 states, Republicans get together, they can do it. In another 4 states, just the legislature can get it across the finish line. The bad news is, in blue states, good luck, okay? You're just not going to be able to move things through blue states. And while it's important to keep the conversation going there, because blue states, Arkansas, West Virginia, can become red states in a 4-year period, as both of those states did and flipped. And I think we'll see more of that as we go forward. But you can do something that only interests the R's in more than half the country. and that's the place to start. As my high school coach said, if somebody gives you $5 for everybody in the bar you can beat up, you start with the guy in the wheelchair. And the red states are the place to start. Pass it in enough red states, and then even the blue states begin to take notice.
So we've talked about some of the barriers and the opportunities that they suggest. So far, a lot of our focus has been on the members themselves, members of the legislature, governors, people who are elected officials, and the often scanty staff that surround a lot of legislators. But let's talk a little bit broader about the freedom movement in the states. To the extent that there have been successes on fiscal policy, healthcare, education, housing, other issues that we care about, from your experience, what kinds of investments over time have paid off? We've got grassroots organizations in a lot of states. We've got state think tanks in a lot of states. We have public interest litigators that have not just been litigating in federal court, but in state court. We have a variety of other kinds of institutions and associations and networks that have been built. Talk a little bit about the importance of that and how you have seen that help freedom-oriented lawmakers be able to affect change.
A lot of this started in the last 20 years or so, and there were a lot of states that didn't have think tanks. There are a number just recently, many still don't have legal efforts, but now Arizona's got a very robust one. A number of states, Michigan, Ohio, a bunch of states do very good legal work. And of all the think tanks, 2 years ago, Alabama would be the only state that wouldn't be considered a pro-freedom conservative think tank, and now Alabama is. So the state think tanks don't go, well, maybe tariffs would be a good idea. Maybe if we gave organized labor a lot of power, things would be better. There aren't any stupid think tanks at the state level that call themselves conservatives. And I don't know whether that's because of the competition among state levels, or in D.C. people have a higher tolerance for stupid. But right now, both the legal beagle efforts and the think tanks are really pro-freedom territory, whether they're in a red state or a blue state.
So my entire involvement in politics has been in the last 6 years or so. And so because of that, I don't know exactly what happened back in the past, but I can tell you that it's pretty clear that we're able to do things as we've proven in Arizona with as Grover said, one vote majorities, that someone's done something right in terms of moving the at least the conversation to a point where we can push for that final win in each of those fields. In addition to that, though, just a note of caution. It's just I think it's very important for think tanks to understand what the impact of what it is that they're trying to do, and that legislators don't make decisions in a vacuum. So just because you're ultra focused on this, whatever it is, term limits or something, that's great. But just remember that you can't, especially in our situation in Arizona where we have one vote majorities, you trashing a member might result in us being no longer in control, which then makes it worse for everything else you're trying to do, and then it eventually makes you, as an organization, hypothetically, of course, it makes you irrelevant and unable to actually have that impact anymore. So nothing happens in a vacuum. If there is a note of caution, that's the only thing I wanted to make sure that everybody's aware of. So you do scorecards, and that's great. All that stuff is fine. But just understand that there are reasons why something happened. And also, I would just encourage all the think tanks out there and all the various organizations out there that are truly dedicated to freedom to really think about what the impact of something is. Because often what happens is you have certain groups, certain individual members that don't actually get anything done, that are the screamers or the bomb throwers or whatever you want to call them, that are always chasing the scorecard. They're going for 100%, or I've heard it now there's 105% on some of them. I'm not quite sure how that works, but and yet they're getting all the high ratings, but they're not actually doing anything, because in order to do something, there's a cost. So yeah, I had to give up certain things in order to get school choice done. I had to give up certain things in order to get the flat tax done. It's just part of the negotiation. It's the nature of having to get a bunch of people on board. So there's no reward for that. There's actually the inverse, right? My score is going to be lower on some of these so-called freedom scorecards than some of these other people that have not done anything to further policy, that have not done anything to help the state in any way. So that's just the reality of what's happening out there. So you should be aware of that as you're thinking some of this through.
So one thing I was surprised by when I really started working in the States coming from DC was I assumed all the good ideas that I saw happening in states came from think tanks or advocates or something like that going on. More often than not, when I find a bill that my clients would be interested in, the legislator, him or herself, came up with this and dug into it in the limited time they had, late at night, trying to see what another state has done, thinking about it this way, using their experience, making laws. So I think we overinflate the value of think tanks on getting things moving, and it's the actual doers who get things moving. So as groups are trying to get involved in the states, especially where you don't already have trust and relationships, you're going to find a lot of stuff that you really like and that's directionally accurate towards where you want to go. That's your time to come in with your expertise and reach out in a helpful way, saying, we love what you're doing. Put out something publicly praising them before it even gets out of the first committee, rather than the DC thing, which is after it's already been signed, then you write the praise article. It's not much good then, besides maybe in an election in the future. But if you want to help get something passed, get involved early. I have never had a legislator turn down help when I reach out and just say, I love this bill. We'd love to get you some talking points. We'd love to do an interview with you. We'd love to fly in some people to testify. They're like, sweet, wait, you just want to help us? And a lot of them don't even know think tanks. My joke is I did a very unscientific survey, but at this point, well over 150 state legislators of, do you know who the Heritage Foundation is? It's less than a quarter know Heritage is. It's a heritage. So think of all the other think tanks. If you're not out there being helpful, you're not going to be known, but it creates a huge opportunity for groups that are scrappier like FreeOp and can quickly engage and not have to go through 500 levels of bureaucracy to get a tweet of support out. All of a sudden, they can be more well-known than Heritage in a state in just 1 year of engaging. So again, I think we put, especially people in this room who have worked on ideas for so long, well, we have all the ideas. Legislators are getting them from their own brains and what they're hearing from their constituents. And if we're going to be helpful and not just a waste of donor dollars engaging in the states, I think it's start by supporting the people who already were swimming in the direction you want to go.
I'm going to echo that and add something to that. I do think there's great value in what's going on in the states in terms of the think tank network, and Cindy Kilduff is here from State Policy Network, and I know that's a network that has grown a lot over the past, really, it's a 30-year-old old organization, but it's grown a ton over the past 15 to 20 years. And it's developed the capacity at the state level from not just from a research perspective, which is what I think most groups spent too much of their time on, may sound crazy, and not enough time actually engaging with lawmakers and doing what Jared just described. So that network's great. I'd say one thing that also is a little different, I'd make this point. I think that there's growing awareness on the right at the state level that we need to do a better job on messaging. I think for a long time, conservatives did a terrible job on messaging. And not only that, we were typically, and this goes a little bit to what the speaker just said, we were kind of measuring success by the noise we were making as opposed to any impact we were having. And so we were typically on, talking heads on TV talk shows or on a radio program, stating things in such a way that the people who already agree with us nod their heads and say, yeah, and we're doing nothing to reach the middle. That has shifted quite a bit over the past number of years. We have a long way to go. There's still some groups out there that actually pose a risk to our success because they claim to be with us, but they speak really foolishly. But I think there's a growing awareness that we've got to communicate better. And the other thing that's happening is these very same kind of state level groups are actually spending a little more time in the community talking to leaders who may not look like them, citizens who may not look like them, believe as they do, better understanding their plight. It's one thing to sit in a Capitol building or in a think tank and say, this policy is going to help these people without ever talking to those people. But when you get in there and you have those conversations, we're finding it makes a massive difference in terms of bringing about meaningful change.
All right, so last question, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions. We've alluded now to D.C., usually pejoratively, which is well earned. What is the single best thing that Congress could do? Imagine a scenario where there is a possibility of passing a significant bill that is not a budget bill in Congress. Just imagine that as a possibility at some point in the future.
Okay.
What would that look like for state? What would be the best thing that Congress could do, or even administration could do, that would help state-based reformers advance freedom and progress?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with what I started with. I think it's in the area of the safety net. Those programs are obviously come to the states with huge federal strings. Basically, the federal government says, do it our way. It doesn't matter what the results are, just do it our way. The best reform that happened in the past 30, 40 years came out of Wisconsin because Tommy Thompson, when he was governor, said, hey, on a specific program, send us the money, but hold us accountable for results, not for how we do it. And now they were accountable for how they did it too, but the point was on results. And within a number of years, that program had reduced the welfare rolls by 75%. Child poverty hit an all-time low. The federal government needs to do more of that. They need to free up the states to innovate around safety net programs. Mauricio Miller has said it really well. Mauricio Miller is kind of a poverty-fighting activist in the Bay Area. And he's looking at the welfare system and looking at how we even do philanthropy in America. He said, we've made poverty survivable, but not escapable. And that is a problem. We've got people who really do want to succeed, but the opportunities have been taken from them. So we need the federal government to loosen up the restrictions and let states innovate.
Well, I think one line that I always use is that people tend to think that ideas trickle down. So it comes from DC, then the knuckle dragging states will eventually adopt it. That is, if almost every reform you've ever seen is the opposite. It bubbles up. So good policy bubbles up to DC. So I always say if your solution starts with, well, Congress should do X, you're living in fantasy land right now. If it was the administrative state needs to do X or a state needs to do X, you're now getting closer to reality. But I bring those up because I was trying to think of how I wanted to answer this question. And I think it'd maybe just be, give each state $1 billion to beef up their AG departments. And the reason I bring this up is my business partner worked for Governor LePage up in Maine. And so often the bureaucrats in DC will threaten a state when they try to make any change at all. So this isn't even where there's a law that they're trying to go against, just over some bureaucratic interpretation. So when LePage wanted to put, speaking of welfare, photo ID on EBT cards, they had officials from the USDA calling saying this is illegal. They come up, send their deputy assistant secretary up there for a big meeting, and they're saying, well, you know what? We're going to determine that you're no longer eligible to receive all the food stamp funding if you put these photo IDs on. Anyone who knows Governor LePage won't be surprised by this, but he just goes, fine, you take it then. I'm not doing food stamps. Like, I don't care. So quickly, the deputy assistant secretary realized, oh, he knows what he's talking about. He knows he has full legal authority to do this, and our bullying tactics won't work. And they're like, oh, okay, yes, Mr. Governor, do whatever you need then. And just dropped it. So often they're not even using true law. They're using administrator interpretations and other extra legal, in my opinion, methods to bully states. So anything we can do to help them push back against this overreach from the feds, I think would be very powerful.
I actually agree with both of those points. I think if the feds are going to give us resources, then if you're going to hold us accountable on results. But let us do what we need to do, because every state's different. And if you truly want us to innovate and for good ideas to rise to the top, and okay, like I said, hold us accountable. So if somebody makes a dumb decision, fine. Then there's some sort of penalty to that. I think states can work with that ultimately. But I actually remember during the flat tax debate, which happened in 2021, we were trying to get that done, and we actually got threatened by the federal government that we're cutting taxes with COVID dollars. And so that was going to be a major thing, and we were going to get sued, and we'd have to backfill all those dollars and all those other things that were there. So they basically said, you can't do a tax cut during this time. You can't do a tax. We did it anyway, and obviously we called their bluff, and it worked. But yeah, that's the same thing. It's like there's all these strings attached to federal dollars. You really want the states to just do amazing things? Do away with all that. hold us accountable for the results, and stop telling us how to do it.
Block grant everything. And that includes, there's a certain amount, several $100 million they give to libraries. Send it to every state. Let them decide how to lay it out. The left has taken control of how you spend the money, the rules on how you spend the money, and what all the pressure points are in D.C. If you send it out to 50 states, they're not ready for that. And the states can decide to spend differently. I would argue, instead of having I know it's a step in the right direction, just give us the money and then complain if we don't solve the problem. I'd say just give us the money, and if the voters don't like it, they'll vote us out. I mean, I don't think the states should answer to the federal government on anything other than, I don't know, running some sort of defense something or other. But no, thank you very much. If you want this done, we'll do it. And maybe we won't do it. Maybe we'll decide we're not doing this at all. We're going to do something completely different. And if our voters don't like it, they'll throw us out. And so suggesting that Washington, D.C. should make the decisions, I think it's a concession too far. I mean, I understand if you have to lie, tell them, oh, yes, you can, for the first few years. But I'd rather just go with, no, we'll take care of it. And again, if you think that something crazy would be done, oh, you do something crazy, then we'll get thrown out of office, won't we? And the answer is they know perfectly well that what you want to do would be more popular, and it isn't what they were doing, and that would make them look bad. So the only thing we should promise them is we promise not to mention how stupid it used to be. We'll just do it differently from now on.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and we have a microphone. If who's going to be our Phil Donahue and cart this microphone to them?
23 states have the full red profile, and 4 more can get that stuff done. In D.C., there's a building known as the Hall of States. It's home to all, not just the governor's offices, but the Medicaid directors, the budget directors, the water pollution control directors, the chief state school officers, and so on. Is it time for the red states to look and see whether these organizations do anything other than be rent seekers for all the distribution of funds in D.C., and get out of it and take the money? You have to pay dues to be part of these organizations. And I'm thinking, why not get a unified effort by 23 states to do just that and be independent?
We've done this in the past. We got all the major states to pull out of the Republican Governors Association, and all the Republican Governors Association did was they'd say, okay, you can pull out, and you won't lose any services at all if you just don't tell anyone you've pulled out. So they wanted to pretend they still represented all the states, but California pulled out. We got everybody. We started in Alabama. It was the #1 applause line the governor of Alabama had. Nobody knew what the Republican Governors Association was, but I traveled around the state with them one day. We're pulling out of the RJ, and everyone, it was a 3-letter acronym, must suck. And so it was wildly popular. Here's the challenge. The federal government funds most of those. The feds give grants to those, and they come up with federal government pleasing answers. And they hire people. The Republican governor of Pennsylvania, Republican at the time, kept the Democrat in Capitol Hill because they had such great relationships with the Hill. They don't politicize their Washington rep. This is even having a Washington rep at all in D.C. They need to be on top of that. They need to take that guy or lady seriously and have them be ours, not somebody who knows all the Democrats on Capitol Hill. What good does that do you?
All right, let's go to the next question.
Yes, thank you all for being here. So having myself working in healthcare policy, there are a lot of things that the states can do on the local level to affect policy. Certificate of need laws with hospitals to improve competition and just addressing, aspects, state provider taxes that serve no purpose other than to drive up the cost of care. But so much of healthcare is dominated at the federal level and is dictated from the federal level. And you look at the ERISA preemption, all these employer-based health plans that the majority of Americans rely on, there's very little the states can do to touch those. So what can we, helping the states with healthcare policy, what can we do on all areas of policy where the federal government has this heavy role and even has preemption provisions in statute? How can we help states to craft laws and ideas that can push against the federal government to a point where we can, perhaps have that critical mass where we can overturn or overcome those preemptory provisions.
Who wants that one?
Well, Greg, you just perfectly explained why I hate working on healthcare at the state level, because you were really fighting with not just one hand behind your back, but pretty much with all but one finger. I mean, that doesn't mean we should give up, and I think this is why Ovik and Michael, in trying to decide free ops focus, realizes that for healthcare, it is the federal government. My pitch for working on healthcare at the state level is it's still a massive budget line item for them. There are some things where they have control over, especially when you have a friendly administration, they'll grant certain types of waivers. But it's hoping that we just have an example so that if they, or when things do completely fall apart and Congress is grasping at straws on how to fix it, we do have some good examples to find. But yeah, you're right. Healthcare is one where that's why I don't like working on it. So.
All right, next question.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. So I'm a lifelong Republican, and I'm also from California, where I still live. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the public schools eliminated algebra from the 8th grade because of concerns of disparate impact. So I'm living in that deep, deep, deep blue center. I love the notion of states, the Federalist notion of states as laboratories, and I love the notion of getting the good word out, particularly given what we know about envy, that envy is a very powerful motivator. It should be a powerful motivator for voters. But my question is, given the state of media today, and given how media just seems completely geared towards bad stories, failures, things that have gone wrong, how do you get the good word out about the great ideas that are working well in your state, and particularly the ones that are working really well in the red states, to the folks in blue states? And I understand that the governor's office in California is probably a lost cause, but there are an awful lot of legislative seats that can probably get flipped if the good word gets out. How do we do that?
Well, again, there's a lot there, and I'm sorry. On the California point, look, it's a beautiful state, and it's amazing how awesome it could be if they had different policy. I would say that it's still a benefit to you that we're doing it, because when you being envious of your neighbor is actually a good thing in this particular case, and school choice is highly popular, not among the Democratic caucus within our body, but among Democrat parents. And so the more and more Democrat parents start asking for it, the better it is, the better the outcome is for you, or the potential outcome is for you. The other thing I would say is, if you do have legislators that are championing it, let's say on the Republican side, because that's where you're going to have to start. And I know they're in the super minority in California, but don't pick a bomb thrower to do it. Pick somebody that can say it nicely. That doesn't mean softly. I mean nicely. That can push the point. That isn't a bomb thrower. That isn't the type that will burn every bridge in sight. And then that way you have a much better chance of it potentially being successful.
I think homelessness is a good example, where up until literally a few months ago, Gavin Newsom had been the poster child from his time as mayor of San Francisco of housing first, or housing only. We're only just going to build free houses for everyone, and that'll solve homelessness. He promised to do it in a decade. It's been 12 years now, and he obviously just failed. But Arizona, finally cleaned the zone, which was them importing terrible California policies to Phoenix. And now Gavin Newsom the left is mad at the governor because he's asking the Supreme Court to take up a case that stops them in the Ninth Circuit from enforcing street camping laws if there isn't whatever the court decides is a version of adequate shelter. So, don't lose hope. Things can always turn on a dime. And I think homelessness at least shows one example of that. Who knows when we'll get there on school choice in California.
All right, I sympathy. I have a lot of it because I'm a native Californian myself, lived most of my life there. Now I'm in Atlanta and happy to be there. But I'm going back to kind of blocking and tackling of activism. I think, and I'm going to steal a line from somebody from the Obama administration, organize where there is a crisis and people feel it. The reality is that school choice gained momentum because there was a crisis. And people tapped into the frustration that people were feeling in real life. I'm not a huge fan of populism for all sorts of reasons, generally speaking, because it can, kind of what was said earlier, it can be demagogic and state-centric. But the reality is that that's just simply building off of a very real longing for people to have agency in their lives and to have agency for their children. So where people feel frustration, organize and figure out how to get them to be a voice for themselves.
All right, Grover gets the last word. It's a little dangerous statement, but I'm
Yeah.
going
Every crack in the wall helps. Be patient. Yes, good examples. East Germany lost because there was a West Germany. That's very important. But 40 years ago, most states, it was illegal to homeschool. It was go to jail illegal to homeschool. I spoke before high school students who come to D.C. and would talk about freedom and the people being locked up in Nebraska because they were homeschooling, and the kids would go, they were guilty. You know, I mean, talk about scary. You know, they broke the law. Now they win all the spelling bees. 40 years ago to this year, I was in a room not that much different than here with 30 congressmen and Gingrich, where we were thinking up deep thoughts, big thoughts, and gold standard and flat tax and balanced budget amendment. And one of every table was of 5 or 10 people, and you'd come up with it. One was zip, pizzazz backwards. Okay, so get some idea that you could be all. And somebody stood up and said, vouchers for choice in education. And one of the most prominent conservatives and a great conservative down the line stood up and said, this is a room only just with our team, okay? There's no press, there's nobody. And he said, if you're going to talk about vouchers, I'm going to have to leave the room. I cannot have it known I was in the room when somebody else discussed vouchers. And now they're sweeping the country. So every little bit we get on charter schools and public charter schools and private charter schools and homeschooling in various different circumstances, and then moving it forward. When we look back, we have made if we make as much progress in the next 40 years as we've made in the last 40 years on some of these key freedom issues, the other team might as well go home. So, I mean, I'd take every little victory and highlight it and take every crisis as the reason to move forward on what we're doing. I am very optimistic because of where we came from. And quickly, one thought. This chart. From 1932 to 1994, 62 years here, okay? 4 years Republicans had Congress, 4 of 62 years. We had a one-party state. Congress runs the country. Presidents have scandals. They have wars, but they come and go. They don't do anything. They can veto things, but otherwise, Congress does the taxes, Congress does the bills, Congress does the laws. In 1994, 96% of Republicans took the pledge never to raise taxes, and ever since then, the vast majority of Republicans in the House have taken that pledge. There hasn't been a tax increase passed as long as the Republicans had control of Congress, and they need the president, just Congress, and now they control Congress half the time. By being the party that would not raise your taxes, we went from being the Washington Generals and losing regularly to the Harlem Globetrotters because we were just sort of not really playing. And now, half the time we have Congress. They're not dominant, but half the time, which is really, really good stuff. So when you lay out a line in the sand that works, stick with it.
All right, Grover, we'll have you back in 40 years and see how your prediction turned out. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to you. We're done.